Hey there, my name's Sebastian, and welcome to Talk Top Pod, a podcast where I have conversations with some of the most interesting podcasters in the world. On today's show, I'll be talking to Howard Dorre, founder and co-host of the Plodding Through the Presidents podcast, an award-winning history podcast that bills itself as an irreverent dive into lesser-known stories about the American presidents and the early republic. Howard, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. Okay, so to anyone that has never heard about your podcast, give us a quick summary.
Yeah, well, you described it pretty well. We dig into lesser-known stories about the presidents and the founders, or ask questions about stories that might be well-known, but we dig deeper. I research these stories and I bring these narrative stories to my co-host, my wife, Jess, who doesn't know what we're going to be talking about, so it's fresh to her. And so it's a mix of like a narrative storytelling format with some conversation and questions from somebody who's not as well-versed in it. And yeah, we just have a great time kind of digging into stories that you might not hear anywhere else. And if you have heard them anywhere else, you're probably going to hear something that you haven't heard about it.
Awesome. Okay. So you started all of this in 2013, is that right? You started by writing a blog.
Yeah, so I was always kind of interested in American history, but no expert by any means. And I wanted to learn more about how we kind of got where we are today.
Mm-hmm.
So I decided that I was going to embark on a project to read a biography of every U.S. president in order. I'd heard of other people doing that. That sounded like a fun way to kind of move through history, starting when the country was small. You know, when there were just a few departments, there might be one secretary in a department. You know, there wasn't like the DMV and, you know, millions of people working in the government. It sounded like a good place to start. Pretty soon, I realized that I loved the founding era, the early presidents, the founders, and I kind of abandoned that project to focus on early American history. And yeah, so I was blogging for a while, and after some time, decided to turn that into a podcast.
Yeah, so in 2020, you turned it into a podcast. So that was COVID times, I guess. What sort of made you decide to kind of make the leap from blogging about, you know, these presidents and early American history to an audio format? You know, I guess sort of creatively, what did the audio format do for you that the blogging wasn't?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. So I do want to call out that we did start in 2020, but we debuted, I believe, in February of 2020. So we had done the groundwork and started the first season before COVID hit. So technically, we weren't one of the COVID-born podcasts, but definitely encountered that. The audio format, I think a lot of readers and people familiar with the kind of stuff that I was writing about mentioned like, oh, you should do a podcast. And I wasn't even that big on listening to podcasts at that point. Then I got a job that had a 1-hour commute. And I started listening to more podcasts and finding out what you can do in that format and how you can tell stories, but also comment on those stories and converse. And that made me really interested. And I realized that I could kind of take the stuff that I was researching and talk about it, but do it with a co-host who could then ask questions, and we could riff and we could have fun with the stories and dive a little bit deeper, because I've never been one who likes performing alone, you know, just talking into the void. I mean, I love writing. I consider myself a writer more than a podcaster, and that's a very lone wolf sort of thing. But when it comes to talking and performing, I like to have somebody to bounce that off of, and decided that my wife was the best person to do that. And, you know, it's convenient because we know each other's schedules, and that's good. But yeah, just the interactions that we have and the way that we're able to kind of connect over the mic allows us to explore these stories in a way that resonates with some folks. And that's been pretty rewarding.
Awesome. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, your show sort of leans more towards exploring kind of the myths, mysteries, scandals, and kind of family drama rather than, I guess, kind of straight political chronology or discourse. I'm wondering how you landed on that lens to kind of do your show through and explore this time in history.
I mean, it might be my ADHD. I've always kind of wanted to follow what I'm interested in. And I'm interested in a variety of stories. And I love the idea of the Monty Python. And now for something completely different. Some people are great at doing that straightforward. We're going to go through each president. We're going to go through each administration. And we're going to talk about what happened next in a chronological way. And that's awesome. But that's not me. I couldn't do that. So I like to sort of skip around to different stories. Maybe there's a theme, but each week is, a different door that we're opening and a different story that we're telling. And that's what interests me. And you talk about myths and mysteries and scandals. I think that the personalities behind the politics are the most captivating to me and the most interesting to me and the easiest to connect with. So I think that's a great gateway into the history. And those bigger stories of rivalries and human conflict, those are the things that I'm really drawn to.
Yeah, and I'm like a very amateur history buff compared to somebody like you. But I've always had, I'm Canadian, I live in Canada, but I've always had an interest in American history as well. And, one of the things that's always sort of struck me is just how wild and crazy the politics were in the early days of America. And, we look at sort of current times and go, wow, a lot of this stuff is crazy, but look back in history, turn back the page a little bit, and there's some wild stuff in there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it shows that as much as the country has changed, and it has, the human drama, that element is still there. We're still the same species, and we still have the same foibles and conflicts and natural proclivity to divide ourselves that was there from the start.
Now, history is sort of very saturated as a podcasting genre. At least I think so. There's a lot of, very well-known shows in that genre. There's a lot of people trying to run history podcasts, taking different approaches to it. I'm curious how, what you've done through the course of the show to sort of stand out and be a little bit different and kind of grow the audience that you have.
Yeah, so I don't necessarily think about how I can stand out so much as what is rewarding and interesting to me, because I think that's what might resonate with folks, because you look for somebody who's authentic, who's passionate about what they're talking about. And when I research things, and I compare historical research to like a gambling addiction, because you dig into something and it's not money so much as time that you're spending, and you don't know when you're going to hit that jackpot. But when you do, when you find some facts, some quotes, something that maybe nobody's talked about before that really encapsulates what you're trying to find or surprises you, you do get that dopamine hit, and it does feel like you're in a casino. So I sort of follow that, and I think that when we approach stories, we look at doing things in a way that appeals to us, and I think that might set us apart, and that's a little different. As far as growth, that's the $1 million question, isn't it?
Well, we could talk about that a little bit later if you want, but just sticking with the podcast for a sec. When I was listening to it and sort of going through some of your episodes and doing a bit of research on it, it seems to me like there's a fairly large kind of comedic element there, whether that's intentional or not. And I wonder sort of how you calibrate between, reporting history, sort of staying true to the facts, but also kind of throwing in a bit of that comedy, while kind of maintaining, sort of the respect for, the fact that these were real people, they had real histories. I'm curious about that.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. The comedy, I would say, it's intentional because it's what I like. I have a background in improv from college. I love making people laugh, and I like the idea of, you've heard of like close-up magic, where like a magician will sit at a table and, do things. Like, I've always liked the idea of like close-up comedy, where I get to know someone for like 10 years, and then I make inside jokes, and That's not so possible over a podcast, but it's the idea of building that relationship and telling a story and finding the things within a story that just make you kind of say, wait, what? And looking at those in a humorous way.
Yeah.
And you're right. A
Yeah,
lot
I
of the
get it.
things that we talk about aren't inherently funny. Like human chattel slavery is not fodder for comedy. But you look at somebody like John C. Calhoun, who said that slavery was a positive good. But then you look at his face and he's a walking nightmare. So that's a way that I can channel that righteous indignation toward pointing out that the man and his soul and how it appears on his face looks like Sam the Eagle, the Muppet, came to life as a human and then died. And that's John C. Calhoun. So digressions like that are fun when we're talking about heavier subjects. And it is a balance. And you want to respect the people whose stories haven't been told before, have been told in ways that weren't fair. So it's just kind of feeling it in the moment. And if something happens that surprises us, that's the best kind of humor, I think.
Do you find your audience will respond to that as well?
Yeah, definitely. I haven't seen many comments of people saying like, oh, that was tasteless, which is nice. Maybe because I edit those out.
Sure.
But yeah, I think people really do respond to the humor more. And the best comments I've ever gotten, and this goes back to the blog, but I've also heard it on the podcast, is that I've been told that listeners scared their cats by laughing out loud so much out of nowhere.
Right.
And there's no better compliment than that.
That's pretty positive. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Now, from what I understand, you structure your seasons around themes. Is that right?
I try to. As I mentioned before, I kind of like skip around and something might happen that pops up and interrupts that, or I get an opportunity to interview somebody who doesn't fit into that. But yeah, sure. I like the idea. We've kind of done some themes before. We've done a lot of presidential pet stuff and animals, just because that's really interesting to me. Recently, we did a season that was mostly about myths and exploring some of the more well-known myths about American presidents and really digging into where did they come from? Why do people say this about these things? So yeah, we try to follow those.
Yeah, and I'm curious, when you're doing your research and sort of deciding, you're planning out your episodes, you're planning out your seasons, and you're doing the research, what makes a story a plotting story, a story that's fit for your podcast, as opposed to, just a random historical anecdote or something interesting, a tidbit?
Yeah, so I love the ability to be able to add to a story in ways that people haven't heard before. So if it's a story that I can find a new angle on, or new details, or something that challenges the consensus, that could make a good plotting story. And it has to be something interesting to me. And I think about Jess, who I'm, talking to across the table when we're recording, and I have to think, is this going to keep her awake? Is this something that she's going to be interested in? She's not a huge history buff. And I'm not speaking to an audience that's necessarily history majors or just historians. I want people who like a good story and just have some kind of casual interest in these types of things to be able to benefit from them as well. So my favorite stories are things that make you go, wait, what? And then I can say, well, wait till you hear what happens next. That's my favorite kind of plotting story. If I can find those are all the elements that really make it fun for me.
Okay. And if someone's never heard the show, is there like an episode or two that you would point them at as sort of a good entry point for the podcast?
Yeah, I would say in our first season, there was one episode that a lot of people have liked. I think it's called John Quincy Adams versus the Internet. And it's about the most popular myths about the sixth president, John Quincy Adams, including that he believed in mole people and wanted to, basically forge relations with them. Those kinds of things. So we dig into those 5 most popular myths, and it's just a fun way to look at where they started from and question the kind of Snapple cap facts that you might see every day that may have no basis in truth. That's a favorite because I love John Quincy Adams for one. Another one I think is a good entry point for me is Thomas Jefferson's Killer Ram. It's a story of how, Thomas Jefferson in the White House had a ram. He had several sheep on the White House grounds that were gifts. And there was one ram that had 4 horns and 2 of them pointed straight forward. And he was warned multiple times that this was a dangerous creature. And it ended up in a fatality on the White House lawn. And this, that's not funny, but looking at the history of it and just the idea that this was something that was allowed to happen and what people said about it and how they turned it into a political thing, there's a lot of background to that story that was really fun to dig into, and probably way too many sheep puns for our own good. But I think that's a nice entry point because it's a story that most people are not familiar with at all. And it really just digs into the idea that something happened that President Jefferson very well could have been impeached for.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, both those sound really interesting. So yeah, those are good starting points, definitely. Now, you've had some notable historians on your show as well, and I'm curious about sort of that process. How do you pick the guests? How do you reach out to them? What sort of, what are you doing to kind of build those relationships and to be able to have guests like that on your show?
Yeah, no, it's been great. I've talked to some awesome guests like Joseph Ellis, H.W. Brands, Lindsay Chervinsky. Reaching out to them, sometimes I'll go through their publicist if they have a new book out, and I'll say like, hey, this is who I am. This is what I want to talk about. I think that, they could really resonate with our audience. That's how I started approaching things in the beginning. Now, sometimes publicists reach out to me, which is amazing. So that's always great. And yeah, I think talking to these historians and hearing their passion for history, it's infectious. And it really infected me. And I think that that's one of the reasons right now I've entered a master's program in history. And I'm going on to, make history more of my full profession, and hopefully mixing that with podcasting and helping others to kind of tell their stories is a goal of what I want to do and write. I've always wanted to write. So yeah, talking to these historians, talking about their craft, I love asking them about surprises along the way and how they do their research, and looking at usually their latest books or what they may have a reason to promote, and finding like, what are they saying about this? And just let them talk about it. Because the secret is, when you get a historian or a professor an episode, you don't have to do much. You just ask a few questions and they will talk, and it's great. And you don't have to edit much. So that's my dirty little secret there. And then another tip, like professors at universities usually have like public facing email addresses, and there's ways to reach out to them that you don't necessarily have to go through a publicist or something like that. And a lot of these folks are just eager to connect to audiences and share their stories because they're passionate about them. So I think that's great for podcasters.
And as far as, I was doing a bit of research on your podcast, and I noticed that you don't do video. Is that right?
That is right. Yeah.
Is that sort of a conscious choice? How do you, obviously nowadays, all the rage is podcasters moving to video. Podcasts are popping up on YouTube, Netflix. Podcasters are using it as sort of a discovery mechanism, especially with, the clips platforms like YouTube Shorts and TikTok. How do you feel about that? How do you feel about, it almost seems like videos becoming a bit of a prerequisite, at least in terms of discovery?
Yeah, so whether it's a conscious choice, I'd say it's a semi-conscious choice. Like, I love the idea of video, and I'd like to maybe repackage some of our older episodes into a video format, but I'd want to do it right. I'd want to add, visuals that make it worth it. rather than just popping up an RSS feed on YouTube. And I say that now, but maybe in a few weeks, that's exactly what I'll do. So it's really just a matter of time and wanting to do it right. And, as a one man, one woman show, there's only so much that we can focus on. And we want to focus on what we can do well, hopefully. So that's just another avenue that I haven't tackled yet. And I think that I tend to be behind the times. Like when I started the blog in 2013, that was as blogs were dying, or everybody said that. And then I eventually, joined podcasts, and that was when that was big and, almost as saturated as it is today. So I think I'll probably join video, and at the time that video is losing popularity, I think that's when I'll probably finally join when it's too late.
Yeah, of course. That's the best time to join, isn't it?
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit more about what you've done to promote your podcast. Take me back to the early days when you were first starting out. What were maybe the first 2-3 sort of concrete things that you did to get anyone to listen, aside from friends and family?
Yeah, so I was lucky to have had a small following from the blog on Facebook. And that was back in the days when targeting audiences was, I would say, a little easier on Facebook. They actually let you pay not much money at all to specifically target folks who loved Hamilton the musical.
Mm-hmm. I remember those days.
And that was such a great fit. Yeah, it was a great fit. And that targeting option is no longer available. They've taken away a lot of stuff that at least I used to be familiar with. So it's not really something I spend time on now. But that helped grow the blog a little bit. And through the blog, I was able to get some folks to listen to the podcast when I started and sort of build up anticipation for that. And then after starting the podcast, just trying to connect with other history folks, other podcasters in the space and, see what groups are they in? What are they talking about? How can I interact with them? How can we share each other's stuff to our audiences? That's really how I started to kind of try to build a following and get more people to hear what we were doing.
Yeah. And when you look at the whole arc of the show, I mean, obviously it's, almost 6 years old now or right around there. What would you say has been the most effective strategy as far as promoting the show over that time period?
I think that appearing on other podcasts and doing like promo swaps, like, hey, I'll play a promo of yours, you play a promo of mine to your audiences, they get to hear about each other, or like an ad read promo swap type thing where like, hey, we're going to talk about your podcast a little bit. You do the same, really sort of a testimonial to our audiences. I think that helped. I found some podcasters that were willing to do that. I think there was a list through Tink Media of podcasts willing to swap. And I reached out to some folks and it was a great experience. And we saw some bumps from that. And I think that that sort of thing can help because you talk about finding an audience. The best audience is going to be folks who are already listening to a podcast. And if that podcast has a similar sensibility to yours, even better. That's the best way to kind of reach folks and get them where they're at.
That's interesting. I've heard that from other podcasters as well, so it doesn't really surprise me. Now, you're part of Airwave Media now, is that right? They're a podcasting network. They specialize in educational and history content. So I'm curious from a growth perspective, what changed when you joined that network? Did you get more sort of this kind of natural organic discoverability? Were there more cross-promotional opportunities, more ad sales, creative support? What did they bring to your podcast that you didn't have before?
Yeah, so the cross-promotional opportunities were great with their other podcasts, them playing ads for ours and vice versa. That really helped with growth. And yeah, so Airwave it's a great network in that we maintain complete creative control. We're still producing the show. We're doing our thing. And they're really just helping with the advertising sales and that side of the business and cross-promotion. And they've helped build relationships with other podcasters and sort of mentoring relationships, which has been great as well. So it's really been a great experience. And I've been able to go to a couple of conferences and work the Airwave booth and meet people and talk to them. And That's been great.
Cool. Yeah, sounds like a good value add for sure.
Yeah.
Now you do monetize the podcast a little bit. You've got a Patreon happening. You're selling some merch as well, and of course the advertising through the network. When you think about sort of somebody that maybe is a casual listener, somebody that is new to your show, and how you sort of move them through the funnel of going from casual listener to kind of a diehard supporter, somebody that's a paying supporter. What do you think are sort of what's the key to moving them along that sort of funnel to get them to be a supporter?
Yeah, I can't think of funnel without thinking of like Temple Grandin and like the path of bringing a cow to slaughter. I wish I had a great formula for it. I know that asking listeners to reach out and listening to them, listening to their feedback and responding to them is just a great way to help build that personal relationship. And I've seen some folks go on to join the Patreon for that because they enjoy being able to interact with the person that they're listening to, and that relationship is important to them. So I think that's one of the best ways. And yeah, listening to what resonates with people, because you're not going to please everyone. In fact, you're going to piss some people off by what you do because it's not what they want to hear. There's some folks who want to hear a solo narrative voice of a man. And, I'm having a conversation with my wife who has feelings and thoughts of her own. And not everybody loves that. And that's fine. There are times when I'm in the mood for a well-produced narrative that isn't conversational and doesn't have interruptions for banter. And there are times when that's exactly what I want to hear. So I get that you're going to appeal to different people. And I think you lean into what works for you and what resonates most with the people who say, I love your show. And that's how you build those deeper relationships with folks.
If you had to start the podcast over tomorrow from scratch, zero networks, zero relationships, but sort of with everything that you know now, what would your launch strategy be like, you think?
Well, I probably wouldn't pick a name that meant slow and boring. I was really going for alliteration there with the blog back in the day.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, I think structure is everything. I think maybe I would have a tighter structure and plan so that people knew exactly what they were getting into from the beginning. That would be helpful. I've helped a podcast launch recently, and, working with them, they knew exactly what they wanted to do. And that was so important because it's like you have to have that vision for what you want so that you can do it consistently and make it work. So, yeah, I think I would probably have a different title, to be honest, because I think that's big. I think I would make sure that the artwork to start with was awesome. I like our artwork a lot now. Our original artwork was fun too. But that says so much to people. When you're scrolling through, you want to see something that looks professional and fun and tells you what you're going to get right away. And I think that one thing I found with our podcast is that it's not necessarily clear that it's going to be a mix of narrative and conversation. And you want to be able to tell people right away what it is that you do so that they get it right away and that the right people are tuning in and listening.
Now, I want to talk to you a little bit about sort of the indie podcast landscape. I'm guessing you still consider yourself some sort of a indie podcaster, though you are part of a network now. The one thing I'm curious about is sort of, in particular, because you run a history podcast, and now we're kind of in an age where there's this kind of YouTubeification of history, a lot of AI-generated content. From your vantage point, how has sort of the indie podcasting world changed between when you started and now?
First of all, yeah, I do consider us still to be an indie podcast because to me, I think that means it's fully created by the creator. there's no production company behind us that's paying for things. It's all an effort of love that we're putting forth. And yeah, there's that advertising relationship and network deal that helps get us in front of other people, and certainly is huge. But we're still out there, doing the same thing we'd be doing without that. Like an indie filmmaker just, taking their equipment, doing what they want to do and putting it out there. Yeah, we're not Conan O'Brien or Amy Poehler, as much as I love them and would like to be either of them, maybe. Yeah, and I think that the indie landscape, it seems like there's more podcasts all the time. Discoverability is a challenge. I think COVID hit everybody in weird ways, in that without long commutes, I know I have less time to listen to podcasts than I used to. And I think that changed a lot of stuff for a lot of people. And that hasn't necessarily completely corrected itself either. So yeah, I don't know how well I could speak to the indie landscape as a whole, but yeah, I know that there's a lot of great podcasters out there. And I think that the ones that are building relationships with other folks and sharing each other's stuff and learning from each other, I think that's the best chance for them to succeed. And I don't know how much that's really changed since we started. I still see that to be true.
You did a whole episode, I think it was called AI versus the Founders, talking about how AI is attacking the historical sources that you depend on. How worried are you about AI-generated podcasts and historical content kind of flooding the internet, flooding the ecosystem, and making it harder for human-made research-heavy shows like yours to stand out?
Yeah. First off, I'm so curious whether that question was written by AI, but I'm not going to ask.
No.
Okay. Yeah. So a little bit of background on that. There was a Facebook post that I shared that I think was a quote from Thomas Jefferson, and somebody commented on it saying, like, is this real? And they had a screenshot of them asking, like, Google's AI, and Google's AI said, no, this doesn't appear to have been anything he said. And I knew, like, exactly where I'd gotten it from the Founders Archive, through the National Archives, great website that has virtually every letter that the founders ever wrote and received. And so immediately I thought, like, I know this is real. How dare AI cast doubt on me? So I went to the founders' website to find it, and the website was down. And it was down because of AI bots scraping it to the extent that it could no longer be up.
Wow.
And I think they made some changes that eventually corrected that, although I still see that site down fairly often when that was never the case before. So yeah, at that moment, I'm like, AI is just really trying to get me. And the proliferation of AI created history content and social media videos where, the video is clearly fake. The voice is AI. Like, none of it feels human at all.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't love it. And I think when it comes to AI, we're still very much in the AOL CD-ROM dial-up period of it, where who knows exactly where it's going to go, how it's going to level out, how people are going to learn to use it responsibly and not rely on it and not just get dumber because of it, because it is super useful. Like, I know for me, there's some stuff I can find that, ChatGPT and other stuff just can't and hasn't been able to. But there's also stuff that I've used ChatGPT and it's been able to uncover some sources that maybe I couldn't have found. So it can be very useful, but it still can't be trusted because it's just pulling together things without the experience of a real person who knows what's what.
Yeah, well, under the hood, it's ultimately just a prediction engine, right? It's trying to predict what is the most likely next word or letter or token. It doesn't actually know what the truth is, right? Because it can't. It's just sort of the sum total guess of what the next, item should be. But I'm curious also, the common kind of cultural discourse nowadays is that independent journalism and sort of independent audio in the form of podcasts are sort of a necessary reaction against that kind of erosion of trust that we're seeing in legacy media. Fewer and fewer people trust sort of the big news sources. So how do you view your role as sort of an independent historian in the media, really, in sort of helping to preserve some of that trust and historical accuracy for, anybody that's listening?
First off, thank you for acknowledging that I am saving the world. I don't know how much of a role I have in anything like the political landscape or the landscape of people differentiating the truth and fiction, but I know that people still care about storytelling and details and truth, at least a lot of folks. And so all I can do out there is put together what I think is a good story that can resonate with people, that I know is deeply researched and is as true as I can attest it to be. And I'm also sharing where I'm getting this stuff. Like, what are my sources? And engaging with those sources, and sometimes arguing with those sources. So that's what I can add is for people who care about stories at a deeper level, or really want to find out, like, hey, Tecumseh's curse, this idea that like presidents born or presidents elected in a year ending in 0, like all of them died for almost 200 years. Like, is that a curse? Where'd it come from? I can dig deep into that. I can find stuff that maybe other folks haven't found as far as quotes shared that are completely inaccurate and maybe are shared in a history book, but came from a novel from the 1920s. That's the kind of stuff that I like to put out there. So I think a lot of people still care about that. I hope. Mm-hmm.
I think they do. At least some of them do. Your show lives in sort of early American history, but a lot of the stories, they resonate with kind of very current debates about, things like democracy and monuments and race and who should be remembered, who should be forgotten. When you're writing some of these episodes or doing research on them, and you're looking at, the founders, how explicitly are you thinking about sort of the current polarized political climate in the U.S. versus just trying to tell a good story and kind of letting listeners draw their own parallels?
Well, I think the heart of it has to be telling a good story and basing it in history, because that's what we do. Like, I never had any intention of creating a political podcast, but I would love it if politics was more boring and the presidency was more normal, and I wouldn't have to care much about that. But because I love history, when I feel that it might be under attack in certain ways or mischaracterized by, somebody who's in the role of the historical role that I cover, it does come up sometimes, but it's not the focus.
Yeah.
But again, I think that people connect with authenticity. And so I have to, be myself and not completely quash any feelings I have that might be relevant to connecting the past with the present, even though that's not necessarily the goal. And some of the guests that I've spoken to, historians, when they're writing about history, of course they're thinking about the present because they're writing for people in the present. And sometimes they'll give voice to those kinds of concerns and make those connections as well. And I think it's unavoidable, but at the same time, it's not my focus because that's not my role with this podcast.
Yeah. And I'm wondering too, from your historical perspective, because you have the knowledge and you've done the research to really know about what the early republic was like. And you've mentioned too that the past was full of crazy times. but sort of that democratic pendulum kind of keeps swinging back and forth. And, we make progress as a society, we take a few steps back. During sort of these recent, I guess, last 10 years, the Trump years or so, the pandemic, sort of the ongoing culture wars, would you say your optimism or pessimism about American democracy has shifted? Again, given what you know about American history.
I would say that my understanding of the fragility of the American Republic has changed, in that the idea was always there that this is the American experiment. But it does feel like we're a little bit closer to a good chunk of folks not caring that much about preserving it to stay in power. So I think that's changed, but I've seen how split we've been in the past. I've seen that from the very beginning, some of the people who helped craft the Constitution, like Gouverneur Morris, the peg-legged philanderer man who I adore, he is the one responsible for the phrase, "we the people," and stopping it there to not be, we the people of the states, to really say that the United States is a nation of people and not just a collection of states. Within 10 years, 15 years, he was ready to tear up the Constitution because he thought it wasn't working out, because, the other side was winning and looking at doing things that he didn't agree with. And, New England was almost ready to secede long before the South was. It didn't happen, but just the idea that even then, the people who built this structure, there was no comfortable delusion that it was perfect or,
right.
Nothing could break it. So that understanding is definitely still with me today.
Yeah, so as you said, it's an ongoing experiment, no question. For me, history podcasts are sometimes like comfort food. They're like comfort listening sometimes, because the past is kind of, over there, it's kind of safely contained. I'm wondering, when it comes to your audience, do you purposely try to kind of discomfort them a little bit with some of the stories you tell?
Oh, that's interesting. I think that the person I think of first and foremost is Jess, my co-host, my wife, my editor-in-chief of the blog since the days it started. Sometimes I take a little joy in discomforting her, I guess, because I can imagine what reactions she might have to certain things. And sometimes it's in a humorous way, like talking about the Billy Possum stuffed toy that was named for William Howard Taft, and just knowing that she's completely repulsed by possums in every single way. But other times I understand that when I talk about women's history or, the history of the enslaved, that she's going to have like even more visceral reactions in some ways than I would. And I kind of welcome engaging that, because I imagine that that's what the audience listening also feels. And I think that those emotions and those feelings should be confronted and are sort of necessary to our understanding. People talk about presentism, and it's like, you can't impose your ideas of, what you feel in 2026 on people in the 1800s. But I look at folks like Andrew Jackson and the Trail of Tears that was super controversial at the time, and you had people saying this isn't right. What you're doing is unconstitutional. You're lying to these people. You're breaking these treaties. You're duping Congress people into signing this into law with false promises. So to say that you're bringing presentist ideas into things, sometimes I think you look at the people and the arguments that were taking place at the time, and you might find that the ideas weren't necessarily imposed on the past. They were already there, and you can engage with those arguments and not necessarily take sides, but sometimes look at what did these people really feel, because they weren't this homogenous group that agreed with everything that was happening all the time. In the 1860s, it wasn't, everybody saying, hey, slavery is great. And then there was a small disagreement that erupted then. These things were controversial forever. And yeah, I'm sorry, that question got away from me a bit, but
no,
yeah,
it's okay.
I think you're talking about making people comfortable or uncomfortable. I think that I enjoy making people uncomfortable if their ideas were that people of the past were always completely comfortable with the things that we now see as morally wrong.
And I'm curious too, as the show has grown and as your audience has grown, have you ever felt any pressure from either listeners or social media or even internally to sort of avoid certain topics or language because you worry, about a backlash in such a polarized environment? How do you sort of decide when to kind of pull back or lean in anyway?
I think I try to keep it grounded in the past and not focus on the present as the main subject of an episode, because that's not what interests me anyway. So I've been pretty lucky not to get too much backlash. And I do hear from people occasionally who might, somebody says I'm MAGA and I listen to your podcast and enjoy it. But, I don't agree with you. And I think that's great, because I'm not creating something just for people who agree with me. And at the heart of it is that I'm telling stories from the past that I think are interesting. And sometimes those are going to talk about democracy or things like that are very much in conversation right now and people have different feelings about. So I don't shy away from it, but I'm also not out there looking for controversial things to attack head on. It's really, if it's relevant to the stories I want to tell, that those things come up. And for the most part, it's really up to the people listening to decide what they think about it.
All right. Final question, Howard. What are 3 podcasts you'd recommend to anyone?
Okay, let's see. My comfort podcast that I love listening to is probably Criminal with Phoebe Judge.
Mm-hmm.
I just love the stories that they tackle, the way they tackle them with humor and heart. That mixture is something I strive to do, and I'm so jealous of people who really get it right. And then a couple of history podcasts, Civics and Coffee, a history podcast hosted by Alicia. She really digs into stories in maybe 15, 20 minutes. But if you're interested in knowing most of what's important about something from just a cool, informed perspective, I really enjoy just picking up an episode of that. And then it's funny, I do this kind of long form narrative stuff for the most part, but I find myself drawn to shorter bite-sized stuff sometimes. And another one is History Dispatches, which is hosted by Matt Breen of the Explorers podcast and his son, McKinley. And I like their relationship. I like that they're able to share stories with each other. I resonate with that. And yeah, I love podcasts where people are telling stories to other people and they're interacting. So things like The Dollop or My Favorite Murder, very different kinds of podcasts, but the conversational aspect of hearing a story with someone else is just a lot of fun for me.
For sure. Yeah, I love The Dollop. That podcast has made me laugh really hard.
Yes, yes.
Finally, where can people find you online?
Well, they can go to ploddpod.com. That's our website. We're most active on Facebook as well, Plodding Through the Presidents. And yeah, wherever you get your podcasts.
Awesome. Okay, Howard, thanks for talking to me today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Sebastian.
All right. Thanks for listening to this episode of Talk That Pod. Make sure to follow us on all the social places. Just search for Talk That Pod. And if you're not subscribed yet, this podcast is also available on YouTube at Talk That Pod Show. Also, if you liked what you heard, tell your friends about it. And if you really liked it, give us a follow or subscribe on your favorite podcast app. And if you're a podcaster who wants to come on the show, go to talkthatpod.net and submit a request. Finding great podcasts is hard. That's why you should also check out Find That Pod. It's a podcast recommendation newsletter I write every week, bringing you 5 amazing new podcasts you should listen to. Subscribe today at findthatpod.com. Thanks for listening, and I'll catch you in the next one.